In this video, I'm gonna create a cinematic foggy environment in Blender.
So to get started, I'll add a plane and turn it into water by giving it a glass shader and some volume absorption so that we won't be able to just look right through it. Then to make it ripple, I'll also add a moving noise texture into the bump, and that's our water. So after that, I'll add some land into the foreground and background and sculpt them into shape. After which, I'll add a base layer of fog using a combination of the principled volume and an emission shader with low strength.
Then giving both of them a bluish greenish tint to try to match the vibe I'm going for. But now that we have these volumetrics, you can't see any detail in the water anymore. So I'll add in an area light to make the waves visible again. I think the general layout of the scene is done now, so I'll move on to the trees, which I'll create using the trees add-on, because the trees look really good and it also has a very nice wind system. So yeah, if you like the trees and want to pick up this add-on for yourself too, then I'll have the link in the description. Then I'll scatter them on the background island. And while I'm at it, I'll also add a house to give the character a destination to go to. It's barely visible in the final render, but I think it's a kind of nice story-based Easter egg. Now, only having the one island looks kind of boring, so I'll add a few smaller ones scattered throughout the lake. And speaking of too boring, the foreground and the shores of these smaller islands look way too empty and just bad. So to fix that, I'll add a few rocks, a bit of grass and some smaller trees to them, which looks much better. But in the foreground, there are still two problems remaining. The first one being that the seam of the water looks bad, terrible, disgusting, bad, just bad. So to fix this, I'll add a bunch of extra thick grass to conceal it. And the second problem is that the color of the rocks and grass doesn't match the rest of the scene, which causes them to stick out in a bad way. So to fix that, I'll use a few hue saturation value nodes to tweak their color and make them blend in better. So here it is before the tweaks and after. Much better in my opinion. The environment is almost done. The only thing I want to do is to improve the fog. After all, it's one of the main attractions of this render. So to do that, I'll add a bit of low-hanging mist over the trees using a stretched out cube and a combination of the emission and principled volume nodes, which I then made more interesting by varying their density using some noise textures. You can pause the video if you want to copy the setup. Some floating fog on the water as well, a whole bunch of mist and fog cards, and lastly a bright emissive plane to emulate that thick fog look. But yeah, now the environment is done, which means we can move on to the bane of my existence, the character. Initially, knowing how long it usually takes me to get a decent or sometimes just bad character, I wanted to use a pre-made one. But no matter where I searched, I couldn't find anything cheaper than $199, which, you know, is a bit out of my budget because it's zero. So yeah, I had to make one myself. And the reason I'm using air quotes here is that I used a free add-on called Charmorph to get the base character and then only had to model a few clothes onto him, which took quite some time to simulate and get looking closest to how I wanted, but still, it's not a custom character by any stretch. Also, by the way, I didn't have time for the pants, so I just inflated his legs and gave them a jeans material, which worked. This may sound easy, but in reality this took over a day, which for the level of quality isn't good. But yeah, then I also wanted the character to row along in a boat, so let's model that boat. To do that, I downloaded some blueprints I found and matched them as closely as I could. Then just sitting the character down and animating him rowing. After that, to make the pedals follow his hand movements, I used the track 2 constraint with the target set to his respective hand bones, which I think worked really well. Except for when it didn't and clipped through his hands, but yeah, other than that, it worked flawlessly. Then I just put a wooden plank texture onto the boat and crunched it up by adding algae, moss and just general dirt. But yeah, now the boat is done, so let's place it in the scene. Which leads me to the next thing I need to do. Because now that the boat is in the water, it also needs to cause some waves. Otherwise, it just looks weird. So to do that, I make the boat hull and pedals dynamic paint brushes and the lake a dynamic paint canvas. Once I set the mode to waves and bake it, we have some good looking interaction. But now I think we can call this scene done. Except I want to do two last things. So first I'll add a bit of extra fog using the mist pass and a blurred version of the image. And also add a bit of film grain using my film emulation node group. But yeah, now it's actually done. So here is the final render. Thanks for watching.